It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
And the New Zealand property market, that continues to be in somewhat of a prolonged housing downturn. We know that we've got a lot of New Zealand listeners because many of them are thinking about moving. It is a buyer's market, no doubt about that, with plenty of listing choices to choose from. In NZ, they've got falling migration. That is a big part of it. And also the amount of Kiwis leaving NZ for Australia. They are attracted by higher wages and better conditions. So if you are a Kiwi who has landed in Australia for those reasons, let us know. We would love to hear from a couple of Kiwis this morning. And a very good morning to you, Robert. Welcome on to the Real Estate Breakfast. It's designed to help you save smarter, not raid your retirement. Well, that is the thinking around that. Do you think that there is enough first home buyers who are actually aware of how the scheme really works?
No, I don't think there are. I mean, I think what the survey illustrates is people's perception of what they would like super to be able to do, or being able to access super for what they want to do. However, I don't think people realise what you and I just spoke about just there. However, it is a tool that people should be looking at.
Yeah, and house prices, of course, they've surged about 43% in 5 years, while mortgage repayments now consume more than half of the median family income. It's no surprise that many younger Australians are searching for different ways to fund a deposit. There has been so much frustration since post-COVID. So is housing affordability now forcing people into these difficult long-term financial choices? I think the answer's pretty clear on that, isn't it?
This is a good tool for people who want to save in a tax-effective environment in order to have a deposit, a larger deposit. So it's certainly a tool that people should be looking at, young people in particular, looking for their first home, because you have this environment where effectively you're only paying 15% tax. You can save a lot sooner or quicker in that regard, and then you can utilise that for your first deposit.
Yeah, some say that early access to super should never be viewed as easy money. I think people sort of trying to access it for buying a property, they're not viewing it necessarily like that. But how important is it to weigh today's housing dreams against tomorrow's retirement lifestyle? Because that is the juxtaposition, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. I think everybody's different. Everybody's financial situation is different. So the first thing I would recommend to anybody is to seek a financial advisor to weigh up what they should be doing. I do want to caution people who look at wanting to access super early for whatever means. We're living longer due to medical technology, etc. Retirement age, everyone still wants to retire at 60 or 65 or 70, maybe at the latest. And you've got to remember that you've got maybe 20 or 30 years left of your life. Your funding for your retirement has to cover that period. And so I think people need to weigh up, as you just pointed out just then, your current focus or your current needs as opposed to your long-term needs. And that's really the balancing act. And that's something that maybe a financial advisor who can look at your financial situation can guide you.
And the real debate isn't just about getting into property, it's about balancing, as we're talking about this morning, two major life goals: owning a home and retiring comfortably. Where should governments draw the line, do you think, between housing and retirement policy?
Again, another good question. At the end of the day, government needs to be more concerned about the long-term retirement of the citizens of this country rather than home loans or rather home ownership. The reason being, obviously, that, as I said earlier, the population is getting older. We're already seeing that population growth is, well, not necessarily stagnating, but slowing, which means if we have a situation down the track of people who have saved for their home, or rather have used superannuation for their home, and then they have very little in retirement, I think the intention is for those individuals to think that they can be on a pension. That may not be the case in 30, 40, 50 years' time. And the whole point of superannuation was to alleviate the need for a pension. So I think the first priority has to be what is the long-term future of our older generation and what it's going to look like when they retire. And home ownership, although it is a struggle at the moment, it is something that, there is cycles and everything. Admittedly, it's becoming very hard nowadays because now it appears that you need 51% of your income to be spent home repayments. However, this is unfortunately the situation that we're in. I think retirement is the concern of the government.
We should talk about spring because spring is becoming a big question at the moment. Do you think that we'll see a stronger spring market, or could uncertainty continue for the rest of the year? I know that is a 50-50 question.
Craig, I've got a bold call. I reckon that spring is actually going to be a market that offers higher clearance rates, better prices, and actually fills sellers with more confidence to sell and buyers with more confidence to buy. Because I think what we're going to see is a lot more realistic owners who are making decisions now to sell based on what the market is doing at the moment. And they'll be heading to market feeling motivated and feeling like selling now is the right thing to do, and potentially willing to compromise more on their price than the owners who are on the market right now. What that will mean is that homes are positioned at a better price point where buyers see more value. And naturally, that, along with the spring optimism that tends to come about, we should actually see a bit of a kick in prices and potentially in auction clearance rates too. So I think it's going to be a good spring.
And a couple of those auction tips, Ari, in terms of what people should be doing if they're heading along to an auction this week.
First thing is, I would not be hesitating if I thought the property was worth a price that was either at the bottom or below the agent's price guide. And I would really think long and hard about why an owner is on the market and why they're selling in this current climate. And I would really want to know their motivation. I wouldn't shy away from offering something that may seem on the surface a little bit lower than what's expected, because you just never know in this market what someone might sell for and why they're looking to sell.
Now, anybody that listens, Ari, to the podcast, they will know that every time I get an auctioneer on the line, I always ask them, what is a standout crazy thing that has happened during an auction that you can share with everybody else? And every auctioneer has got one that they can pull out and say, oh yeah, this was super crazy and this happened to me one time. What is yours?
The craziest thing that's happened to me at an auction was a gentleman winning the auction, had the highest bid. The moment it was sold, the gentleman that was bidding got into his car and drove away from the crowd the moment the bidding finished.
So you never saw or heard from that guy again?
Nothing, absolute nada.
Remember, we are not a real estate company. We are 100% all about increasing your awareness and knowledge for buying and selling properties.
This is a really narrow window of opportunity to get into the housing market at a price lower than what it was 12 months ago. But what's happened over the past particularly 6 weeks is the government, through the federal budget, have talked about enormous changes to housing tax policy and caused market confidence to collapse. And we can see that through every metric, even into new home sales, number of people visiting display sites, number of people Googling new house and land package. All of the indicators have really fallen away very sharply since budget night. However, at the same time, the fundamentals of supply and demand are continuing. And we can see rental vacancies week by week are getting tighter as we build fewer homes than what we need to meet our housing needs. And so as a consequence, this is going to be a relatively short-lived little price correction here. There is no doubt that higher interest rates that came about earlier in the year are a component to that. And Sydney is the market most sensitive to changes in house prices, given that the average price of a house there is well over $1 million these days.
Now, Queensland's recorded the biggest fall in these building approvals, while New South Wales and Western Australia pushed higher. What do you think is happening around? I know you were talking just about the developers with the apartments and detached. Are developers, do you think, becoming more selective about where they're building right now in this landscape? Or are state policies starting to produce very different outcomes for them?
Whether it's state policies or local council policies, it will determine whether we're going to build a cycle of apartments. And what we can see on the Gold Coast at the moment is a very business proactive development local council. Heard the other day the Lord Mayor say that there are 77 cranes erected on the Gold Coast at the moment. So that's going to see a large volume of commencements there. Perth, Adelaide, not typically apartment markets, but very strong level of population growth and economic growth happening there. So it's going to continue to push slowly towards apartments. But of course, it is the Sydney and Melbourne markets where apartments dominate. And in Sydney, we have seen the state government announce a policy where they're going to finance 50% of off-the-plan apartment construction. And that's seen an enormous shift in commencements. In fact, roughly a doubling of commencements in the December quarter of last year. And that's likely to continue at least for the first part of this year.
Let's get back to the detached houses, because I see that the approvals have topped 10,000 for 4 straight months, but higher density projects continue sliding backwards, as you've alluded to. That's a lot, isn't it? 10,000.
It is. It's coming online. Detached housing is much more stable than the multi-unit cycle, and it is largely tied to the release of land or the availability of land. The problem detached have is that in those markets where there is strong growth in demand, Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, we're also seeing land prices rise very quickly as well. Have really been quite fortunate that some of the state government policies coming through in New South Wales and in Victoria have seen land coming online at around about the same price it was 12 months ago. In the case of Sydney, maybe just a little bit less, and that is seeing detached home building in those two regions starting to show signs of recovery despite some of the other challenges that we have in the market with interest rates and the cost of construction.
Are you finding it tough to get a tradesperson in on your property to do some work? Now, since you're from HIA, Tim, how are those numbers in terms of builders? Of course, a lot of them have gone to the wall. Well, I shouldn't use the word a lot, but there have been many that have gone to the wall. They've had to find new employment elsewhere. What are those figures telling us? Where is the trend at the moment?
Well, this is as good as the trade shortage is going to get at any time over the course of the next 4 years. From here on in, the availability of trades become increasingly tight. We have seen the price of skilled trades rising roughly double to the price of the rest of the economy, and that trend is likely to continue. There is no easy short-term fix to this problem while ever we have 4.5% unemployment. And it does look like the economy is going to remain relatively strong. Whether it's government infrastructure projects, mining activity, all of our major potential sources of skilled tradespeople have also very elevated levels of demand. So our expectation is, well, it's not too late to retrain as a carpenter in the building industry.
I think the biggest surprise that buyers often get is that the house looks like it's almost brand new, it's just been renovated and so on. But under the surface, one example that comes to mind would be a house that had been beautifully renovated, but the roof had not been touched and the roof needed to be completely replaced. And in that example, it would have cost, I think somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000. And it had completely scuppered their deal because obviously replacing a roof is a big project. And these people had fallen in love with the house, but the vendors just hadn't done the roof. And I think that, that's just one example. I think the biggest thing for people to avoid surprises is they need to follow up with the person who's inspected a house and talk it through with them. And a lot of buyers don't do that. And I think that's perhaps the most important bit of advice that I can offer to people if they're looking to buy a house.
Yes, because people often panic when they see a defect in an inspection report. But on the flip side, sometimes the bigger risk is what isn't mentioned at all, which is what you're talking about with the roof. So how do buyers separate a genuine deal breaker from something that's simply part of owning a property?
Often the answer to that is what's the financial impact? Will there be a massive cost to the buyer after they've purchased the property or a massive impact on them? Termites are an issue that come up in a lot of areas around the country. So people are very worried about that. That's a deal breaker. If there's active termite damage in a property, you shouldn't touch it. It's very hard to know how severe that damage is going to be. Structural issues in houses are obviously very important as well. Now, those issues should be identified, cracks in walls and so on. Those types of things are the things that can lead to structural problems. Other things that might be more considered to be periodic maintenance, even whether that's painting or whether that's, other sorts of sort of periodic repairs, those things are probably less likely to be deal breakers, but it's all dependent on the individual property, isn't it?
Yeah, we should talk about strata as well, because apartment buyers, they can receive hundreds of pages of strata documents, enough to do your head in, yet they still miss the one issue that really matters. Why do so many people, do you think, focus on the paperwork instead of understanding the actual financial and maintenance risks hiding inside that document?
Well, I think a lot of people are intimidated by strata, particularly the documents. Buildings can be complex, and so it's hard for people to understand, well, for one, what strata is about, but also what is actually going on in the building. This is really an area that's so important for people to get somebody to help them understand the information. There's a lot of paperwork, but sometimes people can't see the issues, partly because they're not presented clearly in a report, or secondly, because they just don't know which questions to ask. Those highlighted issues, so that could be building defects, it could be massive renovation or rectification project that's coming up or ongoing, that's going to have not just a financial impact, but an impact directly, because there'll be scaffolding up on the building for a year or two, and there'll be workmen in the apartment building every day. Those sorts of things have a massive impact on people. And so understanding strata information is really important. And again, they need to seek some help. I think a lot of people just don't ask questions. I don't know whether they don't want to appear uninformed, but it's really important to ask questions. The other thing that's really important with apartments is that there can be telltale signs, whether they've been spending money on maintenance over years, whether the levies are low, whether they've got any money in the bank. These sorts of things are really good signals for potential problems in the future.
Yeah, you talked earlier about the roof that needed doing, potentially 60 to 80K. A fresh coat of paint can distract buyers from expensive structural or maintenance issue. They look at it and they go, wonderful, look at that, a brand new paint job. Now, when I look at something like a paint job, warning bells go off with me, because I think, okay, why have they done that? What is hiding behind the paint? So after inspecting, and I'm sure that it's been thousands of properties for you, what are the most common warning signs buyers should notice before they fall in love with a home?
Yes, your point is a valid one. Obviously people want to present their property in the best light. So yes, they'll repaint it and make it look as good as they can. But yes, you hear plenty of stories of vendors covering up issues with that fresh coat of paint that you mentioned. You shouldn't judge a book by its cover is probably the best thing I can say. You need to look a bit further.
We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.